Experience doesn't matter. Experience doesn't matter when blood runs thicker than profit margins, my boss, Richard Hawthorne, said as he slid the promotion letter across his mahogany desk. My name is Cameron Reed. I'm 34 years old, and I just watched my supervisor hand the leadership of my own project, a revolutionary customer analytics platform I'd spent 18 months building, to his 26-year-old niece, Serafina, who couldn't tell Python from JavaScript if her MBA depended on it. The conference room felt like a courtroom as Richard announced the exciting news to our team of 12 software engineers. Serafina sat beside him, her designer blazer screaming nepotism louder than her uncle's forced enthusiasm. As you all know, Richard began, his voice carrying that artificial corporate cheerfulness, Project Nexus has been our department's flagship initiative. I'm thrilled to announce that Serafina Hawthorne will be taking over as lead project manager, effective immediately. I felt my stomach drop. Project Nexus wasn't just any initiative, it was my brainchild. 18 months ago, I'd identified a critical gap in our customer data analysis that was costing the company millions in missed opportunities. I'd spent countless nights architecting the solution, debugging code, and personally training our junior developers. I'd negotiated with vendors, managed timelines, and somehow kept us under budget while delivering ahead of schedule. The platform was 3 weeks away from full deployment, 3 weeks from what should have been my career-defining moment. But as I sat there watching Serafina nod along to her uncle's speech about fresh leadership perspectives and innovative management approaches, I realized this wasn't a surprise promotion. The way she confidently discussed optimizing deliverables and leveraging synergistic frameworks without understanding what any of it actually meant, this had been planned. My colleagues exchanged confused glances. Marcus Chen, our senior developer, looked like he wanted to speak up but caught my eye and stayed silent. Sarah Williams from QA testing just stared at her laptop screen, probably updating her LinkedIn profile. Cameron will remain as senior technical consultant, Richard continued, providing valuable support during this transition. Support on my own project. I stood up, shook Richard's hand, and congratulated Serafina with a smile that felt like swallowing glass. But inside, something fundamental shifted. I'd just learned that competence was optional, but family connections were everything. What I didn't know yet was that Serafina's appointment would last exactly 3 days, and those 3 days would change everything. Let me take you back to where this all began. 18 months earlier, I was just another senior developer at Meridian Technologies, a mid-sized software company specializing in retail analytics. We had solid clients, decent revenue, but we were losing ground to competitors who offered more sophisticated customer insights. That's when I noticed the pattern. Our biggest client, Pinnacle Retail, was hemorrhaging customers, and their executives couldn't figure out why. Traditional analytics showed healthy sales numbers, but something deeper was happening. I spent my evenings diving into their raw data, looking for connections others had missed. The breakthrough came at 2 a.m. on a Tuesday. I discovered that customer lifetime value was dropping 40% faster than our reports indicated because we weren't tracking cross-platform behavior. Customers who seemed loyal on desktop were actually switching to competitors on mobile. Our analytics were missing half the story. I brought my findings to Richard the next morning. Instead of the usual corporate bureaucracy, he seemed genuinely excited. Cameron, this could revolutionize how we serve every client. What would you need to build a solution? That question changed my life. Over the next 6 months, I designed Project Nexus from the ground up. I created algorithms that could track customer journeys across multiple touchpoints, predict churn before it happened, and identify revenue opportunities that traditional analytics missed completely. But building the technology was only half the battle. I had to sell the vision internally, secure budget approval, and recruit team members who believed in something that didn't exist yet. I convinced Marcus Chen to leave his comfortable position at a larger company because I painted a picture of what we could accomplish together. Sarah Williams joined our QA team specifically because she wanted to work on cutting-edge customer analytics. The nights were brutal. While my colleagues went home at 6, I stayed until midnight fine-tuning algorithms and debugging integration issues. Weekends disappeared into testing sessions and client demos. My girlfriend Emma started joking that she was dating a ghost who occasionally showed up to eat leftover takeout. But it was working. Pinnacle Retail's customer retention improved by 23% in the first quarter. 2 more Fortune 500 companies signed on as beta testers. Richard started calling Project Nexus the future of Meridian Technologies in board meetings. I thought I was building my career. I had no idea I was actually building someone else's stepping stone. The first time I met Serafina was at last year's company holiday party. Richard introduced her as my brilliant niece who just completed her MBA at Northwestern. She was polished, confident, and spoke fluent corporate buzzword with the kind of authority that comes from expensive business school presentations. "Uncle Richard tells me you're working on some fascinating customer analytics projects," she said, her smile perfectly calibrated for networking events. "I'd love to learn more about how you're leveraging data science to optimize customer engagement metrics." I should have been flattered by her interest. Instead, something felt calculated about how she asked follow-up questions, taking mental notes about technical details and business impact. She wasn't making conversation, she was conducting reconnaissance. Over the following months, Serafina became a frequent visitor to our office. Officially, she was exploring career opportunities in tech while job hunting post-graduation. Unofficially, she was getting a front-row seat to everything we were building. Richard would invite her to sit in on project meetings, claiming she could offer fresh perspectives from her business school experience. She'd listen intently as I explained our customer journey mapping algorithms, then suggest we should think more strategically about scalability frameworks without offering any actual insights. The real shift began when Richard started referencing her ideas in leadership meetings. Serafina made an interesting point about market positioning, he'd say, then repeat something I'd explained to her the week before. Somehow my technical explanations became her strategic insights in his retelling. Marcus noticed it first. "Is it just me? Or does your boss's niece keep showing up with solutions that sound suspiciously like your solutions?" he asked during one of our late-night coding sessions. I brushed it off. Family businesses operate differently, and Richard clearly valued outside perspectives. I figured her involvement was temporary. Once she found a real job, she'd disappear from our world. But then the question started getting more specific. She wanted to understand our vendor relationships, our client contracts, our development timelines. When I mentioned we were 3 months ahead of schedule, she asked detailed questions about what that meant for budget allocation and resource planning. "You're really building something special here," she told me one Friday afternoon as she reviewed our latest demo. "Uncle Richard says this project could transform the entire company." Her tone was admiring, but something in her eyes looked hungry. I thought she was impressed by our work. I didn't realize she was calculating how to claim it. 3 months before the promotion announcement, Serafina officially joined Meridian Technologies as a strategic business analyst. Richard positioned it as bringing in fresh talent with modern business perspectives, but everyone knew she was family. Her first week, she scheduled one-on-one meetings with every team member on Project Nexus. With me, she focused on understanding our technical architecture and future roadmap. With Marcus, she discussed development methodologies and code documentation standards. With Sarah, she explored our testing protocols and quality assurance processes. "I want to understand how this brilliant team operates," she explained, her MBA training evident in how she structured each conversation. "My goal is to identify opportunities where business strategy can support technical excellence." Initially, I appreciated her systematic approach. Finally, someone from the business side who wanted to understand what we actually did before making suggestions. Her questions were intelligent, and she took detailed notes about everything from our Git workflows to our client communication protocols. But then the suggestions started. In team meetings, Serafina would propose process optimizations that were really just restatements of how we already operated, packaged in business school terminology. Our agile development became iterative value delivery cycles. Our code reviews became peer-based quality assurance frameworks. Richard ate it up. "This is exactly the kind of strategic thinking we need," he'd say, praising her for insights that essentially described our existing procedures with fancier language. More concerning was how she began positioning herself as a liaison between our technical team and upper management. When executives had questions about Project Nexus, instead of asking me directly, they'd go through Serafina for business-focused explanations. She'd attend my client presentations, then follow up with executives to clarify the strategic implications of what I demonstrated. Somehow my technical achievements became her business insights in their minds. The breaking point came during a board presentation 6 weeks before the promotion. I'd prepared a comprehensive demo showing how Project Nexus had improved client retention and identified new revenue opportunities. Richard introduced the presentation, then handed the microphone to Serafina. While Cameron will demonstrate the technical capabilities, she announced, I'll provide context on the strategic business impact and future growth potential. I spent 30 minutes explaining our algorithms and showing real results. She spent 10 minutes talking about leveraging data-driven insights for sustainable competitive advantage and got twice the applause. That night, Marcus found me still at my desk at 11 p.m., staring at my computer screen. She's positioning herself as the business brain behind your technical expertise, he said quietly, and Richard's letting it happen. I nodded, finally understanding what I'd been watching. This wasn't collaboration, it was appropriation. The signs were subtle at first, but looking back, they painted a clear picture. 2 months before the promotion announcement, my access to certain meetings started getting streamlined. When clients requested updates on Project Nexus, Richard would suggest that Serafina handle the communication to ensure consistent messaging. My signature authority on technical decisions remained intact, but strategic discussions increasingly happened without me. I'd arrive at work to find that Serafina had already briefed the executive team on project status and future roadmap considerations during their early morning meetings. Cameron's doing incredible technical work, she'd tell anyone who asked, but I'm helping translate that into business value propositions that our leadership can understand and our clients can appreciate. The most troubling change was how my direct reports started getting mixed signals. Sarah came to me confused about conflicting priorities. Serafina says we should focus on user interface improvements for the demo next week, but you want us to prioritize the security audit. Which takes precedence? When I approached Richard about clarifying the chain of command, he waved off my concerns. Serafina's just trying to help coordinate between technical and business priorities. You're both valuable contributors to this project's success. But the coordination felt more like interference. She'd schedule alignment meetings with team members to discuss their work, then send summary emails to Richard that positioned her as the central coordinator of all project activities. My technical leadership was being systematically undermined by her administrative management. The breaking point came 3 weeks before the promotion. I discovered that Serafina had been having weekly strategy sessions with Richard about Project Nexus transition planning. When I asked what kind of transition, Richard claimed they were discussing long-term sustainability and growth strategies. That same week, I noticed that my name had been removed from several key project documents. My role was listed as Senior Technical Consultant instead of Project Lead on Client Communications. When I questioned this change, Serafina explained that they were clarifying roles and responsibilities to better reflect the collaborative nature of our team structure. Marcus pulled me aside after another confusing team meeting where Serafina had announced timeline changes I hadn't approved. She's systematically taking credit for your work, while positioning you as just another team member. And Richard's either oblivious or complicit. The final warning sign was the budget review meeting I wasn't invited to. Serafina presented our quarterly report to the finance team, discussing resource allocation and future funding needs for her project coordination efforts. I only learned about it when Sarah mentioned seeing the meeting notes accidentally copied to her email. That night, I realized I'd been naive to think competence and results would speak for themselves. While I'd been building and delivering, someone else had been building relationships and narratives. The technical success of Project Nexus was never in question, but ownership of that success was being quietly transferred away from me. The weekend after Serafina's promotion announcement, I couldn't sleep. Something about the timing felt too convenient, too calculated. I decided to do what I do best, dig into the data. I started with email timestamps. Using our company's internal search system, I traced the communication patterns around Project Nexus over the past 6 months. What I found made my blood run cold. Serafina hadn't just been observing our project. She'd been systematically documenting it. Every technical meeting, every client conversation, every strategic decision had been meticulously recorded and forwarded to Richard, with her own interpretation attached. But more damning were the emails I found buried in a shared folder I rarely accessed. 3 months ago, Richard had sent a message to HR discussing succession planning for high-visibility projects and preparing next-generation leadership for increased responsibility. The smoking gun was a document titled Project Nexus Transition Strategy, dated 6 weeks before the promotion announcement. The plan outlined how to gradually shift project ownership from technical development to strategic management while maintaining operational continuity during leadership transition. They'd been planning this for months. But the worst discovery was a draft email I found in Richard's shared folder, apparently never sent, but clearly intended for Serafina. As we discussed, Cameron's technical expertise has been invaluable in getting us to this point. But moving forward, we need someone who can think strategically about market positioning and business development. Your MBA background and fresh perspective are exactly what this project needs to reach its full potential. I printed everything and took it home. That Sunday night, I sat at my kitchen table reading through documents that proved this wasn't a sudden decision based on merit or potential. This was a calculated appropriation of my work, planned and executed over months while I'd been focused on actually delivering results. The most infuriating part was a performance review I discovered that Richard had written about me 6 months earlier. Cameron is an exceptional technical contributor, but lacks the strategic vision necessary for senior leadership roles. While his expertise is valuable, he would benefit from working under someone with stronger business acumen, strategic vision. I'd identified the market gap, designed the solution, and delivered results ahead of schedule. But apparently that wasn't strategic enough because I didn't have an MBA and wasn't family. Emma found me still at the kitchen table at 2 a.m., surrounded by printouts and looking like I'd seen a ghost. "What's all this?" she asked. "Evidence," I said. "Evidence that I've been played." She sat down across from me and started reading. After 20 minutes, she looked up with fire in her eyes. "Cameron, this is corporate theft. They've stolen your work and documented the entire process." I nodded, feeling something shift inside me. I'd spent my career believing that good work would be recognized and rewarded. Now I had proof that politics and nepotism trumped competence every time. But I also realized something else. They might have stolen credit for my work, but they couldn't steal my actual expertise. And expertise, I was about to learn, was much more powerful than corporate titles. Monday morning arrived with an email from Serafina to the entire Project Nexus team. Exciting changes ahead. New leadership vision for our success. Her first official act as project manager was to schedule a strategic realignment meeting where she would share her vision for optimizing our workflow processes and enhancing deliverable quality. I watched in horrified fascination as she confidently explained to my own team how we should be doing the work I'd trained them to do. Moving forward, we'll be implementing a more structured approach to development cycles, she announced, describing a process that was essentially what we were already doing, but with more documentation and approval layers. Marcus caught my eye and barely suppressed a smirk. Sarah looked confused when Serafina suggested we needed better integration between front-end user experience and back-end data processing capabilities, a problem we'd solved months ago. But the real disaster began when clients started asking technical questions. Pinnacle Retail's CTO called on Tuesday morning with concerns about the upcoming deployment. Serafina took the call while I sat in her office, officially there to provide technical support, but really to watch her fumble through concepts she'd heard but never understood. "Absolutely. We're confident in our data integration methodologies," she said with practiced authority. "Our algorithms utilize advanced machine learning protocols to optimize customer engagement metrics across multiple touchpoints." It sounded impressive until the CTO asked a follow-up question. "What specific machine learning models are you using? And how do you handle data normalization across different customer platforms?" The silence stretched for 15 seconds. I could see panic flash across Serafina's face before she recovered with, "Cameron, would you like to address the technical specifics?" I spent the next 20 minutes explaining our actual implementation while she nodded along, occasionally adding meaningless phrases like exactly. That's the kind of robust, technical architecture that supports our strategic business objectives. After the call, she turned to me with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. I think it's more efficient if you handle the technical discussions while I focus on strategic coordination with our business stakeholders. Translation: she had no idea what she was talking about and needed me to do the actual work while she took credit for it. The pattern repeated throughout the week. When our lead developer flagged a critical security issue, Serafina suggested we leverage our existing security frameworks to mitigate potential vulnerabilities. Corporate speak for I don't understand the problem. When Sarah discovered a bug that could corrupt client data, Serafina proposed a comprehensive quality assurance review process, which meant delaying the fix while she figured out what was actually wrong. By Thursday, I was essentially doing my old job while she attended meetings and sent emails about coordinating our collaborative efforts for maximum impact. But the breaking point came Friday afternoon. Serafina called an emergency team meeting to discuss concerning feedback from our stakeholder community. She'd somehow convinced herself that client questions were complaints and that our technical explanations were confusing people. We need to simplify our messaging and focus on business value rather than technical details, she announced. Moving forward, all client communications will go through me to ensure consistent strategic positioning. Marcus leaned forward. So you want us to stop explaining how our system actually works? I want us to focus on what matters to our clients: results and business impact. The technical details are less important than the strategic value proposition. That's when I realized she fundamentally misunderstood everything about our work, our clients, and our industry. She thought Project Nexus was a black box that produced results through magic, not a sophisticated system that required technical expertise to implement and maintain. I went home that night, knowing that Serafina was about to destroy everything I'd built, not through malice, but through sheer incompetence masked by MBA buzzwords. Saturday morning, I was debugging code at home when Emma came in with coffee and a strange expression. "You need to see something," she said, handing me her laptop. I was curious about Serafina's background, so I did some LinkedIn research. What she'd found changed everything. Serafina's LinkedIn profile told a very different story than her polished corporate persona. Before Northwestern, she'd worked at a boutique consulting firm called Strategic Dynamics. The company specialized in technology transfer and business development for emerging market opportunities. But the real revelation was buried in the company's case studies. Strategic Dynamics helped established firms identify promising technologies and talent, then positioned their clients to acquire or replicate those innovations. They were corporate headhunters for intellectual property. "Look at this," Emma said, scrolling to a blog post Serafina had written 18 months ago. "The Art of Strategic Technology Assessment: How to Identify and Leverage Emerging Innovations in Competitive Markets." The post outlined a methodology for infiltrating tech companies, documenting their processes, and positioning external stakeholders to capitalize on internal innovations. It was essentially a playbook for corporate espionage disguised as business strategy. My blood ran cold as I read her description of embedding strategic analysts within target organizations to assess technical capabilities and market potential. This wasn't nepotism, this was planned acquisition. I immediately called Marcus. "Can you meet me at the office? I found something you need to see." An hour later, we were in our conference room with Emma's laptop, piecing together a conspiracy that went much deeper than family favoritism. Using our internal systems, I started tracing connections between Strategic Dynamics and Meridian Technologies. The smoking gun was a consulting contract I found buried in our financial records. 6 months ago, Meridian had hired Strategic Dynamics for competitive analysis and market positioning assessment. The contract was signed by Richard and included a clause about embedding qualified analysts for comprehensive technology evaluation. Serafina hadn't just joined the company, she'd been placed here. Marcus pulled up Strategic Dynamics' client list. "Cameron, look at this. 3 of their biggest clients are our direct competitors: Apex Analytics, Data Flow Solutions, and Quantum Insights. The pattern became clear. Serafina wasn't Richard's niece trying to build a career in tech. She was a corporate spy sent to steal our intellectual property. Her MBA wasn't credentials for leadership. It was cover for infiltration. But the most shocking discovery came when I accessed our server logs. Over the past 6 months, Serafina's company laptop had been downloading massive amounts of data: source code, client databases, proprietary algorithms, financial projections. Everything needed to replicate Project Nexus at a competitor. She's not incompetent, I realized. She's been playing dumb while systematically stealing everything we've built. Emma looked up from reading another strategic dynamics case study. It gets worse. According to this, their standard timeline is 6 to 8 months for comprehensive technology assessment and strategic positioning. She's been here exactly 6 months. The promotion wasn't the end game. It was the final phase. Give her official access to everything. Let her complete the data extraction, then probably resign with some excuse about pursuing new opportunities while our competitors launched versions of Project Nexus. But as I sat there processing the magnitude of the betrayal, I realized something crucial. They'd made a fundamental miscalculation. They'd assumed that stealing my work would be enough to replicate my success. They thought Project Nexus was just code and algorithms that could be copied and pasted into a new environment. They had no idea that the real value wasn't in what I'd built. It was in what I knew. Sunday night, I sat in my home office with a decision to make. I could expose Serafina's deception and fight for my project, probably resulting in a messy corporate investigation that might vindicate me, but would definitely destroy Project Nexus in the process. Or I could do something more strategic. I opened my laptop and created a new folder, Operation Reverse Engineering. If Serafina and her handlers wanted to steal my work, I'd let them. But they were about to learn the difference between copying innovation and understanding it. My first move was to identify what they actually had versus what they thought they had. The server logs showed Serafina had downloaded our code base, but she couldn't access our real-time client data or our proprietary testing environments. More importantly, she'd never been involved in the actual problem-solving that made Project Nexus work. Code without context is just syntax. Algorithms without understanding are just mathematical formulas. They could copy what I'd built, but they couldn't replicate why it worked or how to adapt it when problems inevitably arose. Over the next 2 days, I quietly began documenting everything. Not just the technical specifications, but the reasoning behind every decision, the client insights that drove each feature, the industry relationships that made implementation possible. I created a comprehensive record of not just what Project Nexus was, but why it existed and how it solved real problems. Then I started making strategic modifications. Nothing dramatic, just subtle changes to our core algorithms that would be invisible to someone copying code, but would create significant problems during implementation. I adjusted our data validation protocols, modified our error handling procedures, and tweaked our performance optimization settings. To anyone actually using the system, these changes were improvements. To someone trying to reverse engineer our work, they would create mysterious failures that couldn't be solved without understanding the underlying business logic. Wednesday morning, I implemented my master stroke. I created a new testing environment that appeared to be our production system, but was actually a carefully crafted simulation. Any data extraction from this environment would capture convincing but ultimately useless information. Then I casually mentioned to Serafina that we were migrating to new servers for security purposes and that she should update her access credentials to maintain connectivity. She eagerly accepted the new login information, not realizing she was now downloading carefully curated misinformation. But my real strategy wasn't about sabotaging their theft. It was about building something better. That evening, I activated a plan I'd been developing since Marcus first warned me about Serafina's positioning. 6 months ago, during a particularly frustrating week with corporate bureaucracy, I'd registered a domain name and set up a basic LLC, Nexus Innovations. It was time to activate it. I'd learned from watching Serafina that relationships were more powerful than technology. While she'd been documenting our code, I'd been building trust with our clients. While she'd been impressing executives with buzzwords, I'd been solving real problems for real people. The question wasn't whether I could rebuild Project Nexus. It was whether our clients would follow me when I did. Thursday morning brought the opportunity I'd been waiting for. Serafina called me into her office with what she clearly thought was devastating news. "Cameron, I've been reviewing our project documentation, and I'm concerned about knowledge gaps in our team structure," she said, her tone suggesting she'd discovered some critical flaw. "If something happened to you, we'd lose too much institutional knowledge about the technical implementation." I nodded seriously. "That's a valid concern. What do you suggest?" "I think we need comprehensive documentation of all your processes, algorithms, and client relationships. A complete knowledge transfer that ensures business continuity regardless of personnel changes." She was asking me to document everything needed to steal my work, framing it as responsible business planning. The audacity was almost impressive. "That makes sense," I replied. "How detailed should this documentation be?" "Extremely detailed. I want to understand every decision, every technical choice, every client preference. Think of it as creating a complete operational manual for Project Nexus." Over the next week, I gave Serafina exactly what she asked for. Sort of. I created hundreds of pages of technical documentation that looked comprehensive but was actually a masterpiece of strategic misdirection. The client relationship summaries were accurate but incomplete, focusing on surface-level preferences while omitting the deeper insights that made partnerships work. The technical specifications were precise but misleading, describing our current implementation without explaining the iterative problem-solving that had led to those solutions. Most importantly, I documented our proprietary algorithms using the modified versions I'd created specifically for this purpose. Anyone trying to implement these exact specifications would encounter mysterious performance issues and data validation errors that couldn't be resolved without understanding the real business logic. But while I was feeding Serafina useless information, I was simultaneously having very different conversations with our key stakeholders. When Pinnacle Retail's CTO called with questions about our upcoming contract renewal, I suggested we schedule a face-to-face meeting to discuss their long-term analytics needs. When Data Point Industries expressed interest in expanding their implementation, I offered to personally oversee the integration process. These weren't official business meetings. They were relationship-building conversations that happened to occur during my lunch breaks and after work hours, completely above board but strategically essential. "You know, Cameron," Pinnacle's CTO mentioned during our coffee meeting, "we've been thinking about bringing some of our analytics capabilities in-house. Would you ever consider consulting work?" Similar conversations were happening across our entire client base. Not because I was actively recruiting, but because I was solving their real problems while Serafina was learning to speak in buzzwords. By the following Friday, I had detailed conversations with every major client about their future analytics needs, independent consulting relationships, and their honest assessment of Project Nexus under new management. The picture was clear. They trusted the technology, but they trusted me more. That weekend, I incorporated Nexus Innovations as a full consulting company, established business banking, and created a basic website. Monday morning, I would be ready to offer our clients something Serafina could never provide, the actual expertise behind the technology they relied on. But I still had one more card to play, something that would expose the entire conspiracy while positioning me as the solution rather than the victim. Monday morning, I arrived at the office to find chaos. Sarah was at her desk looking panicked, Marcus was on a frantic phone call, and Serafina was nowhere to be seen. "What's happening?" I asked Sarah. "The deployment to Pinnacle crashed over the weekend," she said, her voice tight with stress. "All their customer data is showing corrupted analytics, and Serafina can't figure out why. She's been in Richard's office since 7 a.m. trying to explain what went wrong." I walked over to Marcus, who was just hanging up from what sounded like a very difficult conversation. "Pinnacle's CTO is threatening to pull out of the contract," he said quietly. "The system we deployed isn't matching their testing environment, and it's generating completely wrong customer insights. They're saying it's going to cost them millions if they make business decisions based on this data." I sat down at my workstation and pulled up the deployment logs. Immediately, I could see what had happened. Serafina had used the modified algorithms I documented for her knowledge transfer project instead of our actual production code. The system was running exactly as I'd designed it, to fail catastrophically when implemented without understanding the underlying business logic. But this wasn't sabotage, this was incompetence. She'd replaced working code with documentation because she couldn't tell the difference between operational systems and technical specifications. 20 minutes later, Serafina emerged from Richard's office looking like she'd seen a ghost. She walked directly to my desk. "Cameron, we have a critical situation. The Pinnacle deployment is failing, and I need you to identify the technical issues immediately." I looked at her with what I hoped was professional concern. What specific problems are they experiencing? The customer analytics are generating incorrect insights. The data validation is rejecting valid inputs, and the performance metrics are showing system degradation under normal load. Every single issue was a direct result of implementing the modified algorithms I documented, but explaining that would require admitting she'd replaced our production code with untested specifications. "I'll need to review the deployment configuration," I said. "Can you show me exactly what was implemented?" The next hour was a masterclass in watching someone realize they were completely out of their depth. Serafina couldn't explain why she'd changed our proven algorithms, couldn't justify the implementation decisions, and couldn't troubleshoot problems she didn't understand. As I worked to identify the mysterious issues, my phone started ringing. First Pinnacle's CTO, then DataPoint Industries, then 3 other clients who'd heard about the deployment problems and were suddenly concerned about their own implementations. "Cameron, thank God," Pinnacle's CTO said when I answered. "Can you personally oversee the fixes for this situation? We need someone who actually understands what went wrong." Similar conversations repeated throughout the morning. Every client wanted to speak directly with me, not with Serafina or Richard. They'd lost confidence in Project Nexus under new management and wanted reassurance from someone they trusted. By noon, Richard called an emergency meeting. Serafina sat beside him looking defeated while I presented my analysis of the deployment failure. The issues stem from implementing modified algorithms that weren't properly tested in our production environment, I explained diplomatically. The technical specifications that were documented for knowledge transfer purposes weren't intended for direct implementation. Richard looked confused. "What technical specifications?" Serafina finally spoke up, her voice barely above a whisper. "I thought the documentation Cameron prepared was the actual system configuration." The room fell silent as everyone processed what she'd just admitted. She'd replaced our working system with documentation because she couldn't distinguish between operational code and technical descriptions. "How long will it take to fix?" Richard asked. I looked at the mess she'd created. Corrupted data, confused algorithms, and panicked clients. Assuming we can restore the original configuration and rebuild client confidence. Several weeks, minimum. That's when my phone rang again. Pinnacle's CTO, calling on speaker. "Cameron, we've made a decision. We're terminating our contract with Meridian effective immediately, but we'd like to discuss continuing our analytics relationship through your consulting company. Can we schedule a meeting this week?" Serafina's face went pale as the implications hit her. Richard stared at me in shock. "I'm sorry," I said, standing up from the conference table. "I resign." As I packed my desk that afternoon, Serafina approached me one final time. "Cameron, I don't understand what happened," she said, tears streaming down her face. "I followed your documentation exactly." I looked at her. This corporate spy who'd infiltrated my team, stolen my work, and destroyed my project through sheer incompetence, and felt something like pity. "That's the problem, Serafina," I said quietly. "You followed documentation instead of understanding the work." She quit 2 hours later. 3 days later, I was sitting in my new office, a modern co-working space downtown, when Emma brought me coffee and the morning news. "Serafina officially resigned yesterday," she said, handing me her laptop. "According to LinkedIn, she's pursuing new opportunities in strategic consulting." I wasn't surprised. Once the Pinnacle deployment failure exposed her incompetence, other clients started asking uncomfortable questions about their own implementations. Within 48 hours, Data Point Industries, Quantum Solutions, and 2 other major accounts had terminated their contracts with Meridian. The final blow came when Marcus called me Tuesday evening. Richard tried to fix the Pinnacle deployment himself, he said, his voice mixing frustration with dark humor. He made it worse. Their entire customer database is corrupted now, and they're threatening legal action. But the real vindication came Wednesday morning when my phone started ringing with opportunity calls. "Cameron, this is Jennifer Walsh from Apex Analytics," the first caller said. "We've been following the situation at Meridian, and we're interested in discussing a partnership with your consulting company. We understand you're the actual architect behind Project Nexus." Similar calls followed throughout the week. Companies that had been Meridian's competitors were now eager to work with me directly. They'd watched Project Nexus succeed under my leadership and fail under Serafina's management, and they'd drawn the obvious conclusion about where the real expertise resided. The irony was perfect. Serafina had been a corporate spy sent to steal my intellectual property for competing firms, but her spectacular failure had convinced those same competitors that they should just hire me instead of trying to replicate my work. By Friday, I had consulting contracts worth more than my annual salary at Meridian, and 3 companies were discussing long-term partnerships that would eclipse anything I could have achieved as an employee. But the most satisfying moment came when Sarah called to tell me about the aftermath at Meridian. Richard's been trying to rebuild the team, but Marcus gave his notice yesterday. Half the development staff is updating their resumes, and our remaining clients are asking if